So this is part two of the history lecture. I promised this to you Monday, and here it is Tuesday. Sorry. I will get caught up someday. Hopefully some of you can relate to that situation. But how are you? Hope everything is well. Let's get right in here. So if you haven't already done so, it's time to start thinking about church visitation locations. Give me, just like with the interview, I want more than just, hey, I'm thinking about this, some type of person. I want a name. I want an actual church location. I warned you in the last installment, I guess that's the best thing to call these. Be careful in your selections. I don't want to scare you away from Greenhouse or St. Augustine or any of the really popular churches for this. That's not my intent. I just want to know what your goals are. If this is the only churches that work for you, or if you have a special reason to be drawn to these churches, then go for it. Don't feel like you have to skip out and go somewhere else. But if you're looking to make your work distinctive, I might recommend finding someplace that's a little bit different. I'm most interested in, honestly, more than the churches themselves, I'm more interested in the contrast between them. Like if you go pick a Lutheran church that is catering to Gainesville residents who are not students, so has a little bit of an older population, then go find St. Augustine because it's a young Catholic church that caters to college students. Do you see how the opportunities are there for really interesting contrasts and how you can draw those things out and what makes those churches different? So think about the contrast, again, not just in theology, but in demographics. Who do they cater to? What is it a high church situation? Is it a low church situation? What type of building is it? Does it meet in a school gymnasium? Does it meet in a massive cathedral? Think about all those details because I want your presentation, your paper, to be as holistic as you can make it. So anyway, today we're continuing church history part 2, going way too fast. Going to continue. We kind of brushed up against the Middle Ages last time. We talked about Thomas Aquinas. Again, a massively influential theologian. We talked about his natural law before. But Aquinas is just ridiculously influential, even today, particularly in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is really connected to Aquinas, more so than the Protestant Church has. But even in the Protestant Church, Aquinas is a huge name, a name you need to know, the preeminent Middle Ages theologian. And speaking of the Middle Ages, quote-unquote Middle Ages, I don't know about you, but in my history classes growing up, it was often seen as a low point. It was, you have the great period of the Greeks and the Romans and this flourishing of culture and ideas and all these really beautiful things, and then the Dark Ages, which were governed by superstition and, all this violence and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden, oh, hey, the Enlightenment, cool. We're back into the age of reason and things are beautiful again. And we've rediscovered the Greeks again and all is right with the world. The medieval period, the Middle Ages, roughly synonymous with each other, is often seen as a down, is seen as a low point, as seen as just nothing. If you've ever ridden, maybe this reference will be lost on you if you haven't. But if you've ever ridden Spaceship Earth, for instance, the big ball in Epcot Center at Disney, tons of time given to the Greeks and the Egyptians and the ancient civilizations, tons of time given to the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. When it comes to the Middle Ages, we burned down the Library of Alexandria, but you know what? There were some monks who copied old books. Yeah, I think if Aquinas ever wrote Spaceship Earth, he'd say, yeah, we did a little bit more than that, y'all. There was a little bit more going on. So, even though, and when everyone says, yeah, but when people are presented with this, they go, yeah, what about the Crusades? People killing each other over superstition and religion, and how stupid is that? The Crusades are interesting, and I'm only going to deal with them briefly because I don't have the time to give them what they deserve, really. But it is interesting how when cultures bump up against each other and how doctrine is affected, and how when doctrine is used to shield less than heavenly motives, right? Because it was, land grabs based in theology are still land grabs. Crusades are one of those ones that are often thrown at Christians saying, see, this is the evil, this is the ridiculousness that your religion can drive. What I would say to that is that the Crusades were way more complicated than they were often made out to be. But they were, I think, without question, exercises of church power gone wrong. And what you see in the Middle Ages, you see good things. We talked about scholasticism, we talked about Aquinas. You see a lot more good things than it's often given credit for. But you also see problems, and a lot of those problems stem from unchecked power. The papacy is at its height in the Middle Ages before it gets knocked down a few pegs. The political power of the church in the medieval period was massive. It was immense. Because what it was political power and theological power being joined together. You had both sides of the spectrum. It wasn't, let's keep the religion over here and let's keep politics over here. It was bang. Let's bring them together and let's give both of those powers to the same group, the same individual. So when you consider how popes lined up against kings in the medieval period, the analogy that was often used was that there were greater and lesser lights. The pope was the sun figure in this, whereas the kings were the moons. So right there, you get a sense of how the disparity, the difference in power. It was not that the kings and the political machinery did not possess power. It absolutely paled in comparison to the power that the church wielded, not the popes wielded, especially at their height. There is a famous story about Henry IV, who was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, present-day Germany, who angered Pope Gregory VII. Pope Gregory VII excommunicated him, and that was the source of the church's power. The church could and did wield the threat of excommunication. You are cut off from the body of the church. And the way that theology was written, if you were cut off from the body of the church, you were cut off from everything that the church had to offer, including salvation. So it wasn't just like today, where if you get kicked out of a church, okay, I'll just go to the church down the street. If you get kicked out of the church, your very soul is in jeopardy. Your very soul is in danger of damnation. So there is no more powerful motivation for a medieval figure. So Pope Gregory VII excommunicates Henry IV, the Holy Roman Empire, emperor. I mean, a man accustomed to power, accustomed to getting his way, right? Henry, remember this is modern day Germany, walks to Italy, and legend has it, stands barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside the castle where Pope Gregory VII was staying, saying, please change your mind, please let me back in, please don't excommunicate me. I mean, that is power. If you can make an emperor just completely humiliate themselves, suffer, in order to change your mind. That was the power that the popes were having. And as you can imagine, you know how the story ends. Power goes to the head. It's, the old Lord Acton line, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's pretty close to absolute power. And as a result, yes, the papacy was indeed corrupted, and the corruption led to schism, and they led to further, corruptions and perversions and stuff that just should not have, stuff that you would not figure would be going on associated with the papal office. We talked about, Dreyer with Nicholas III, and it's interesting because the way in which that particular reflection went down, a lot of you Protestant evangelicals were like, yeah, I could see how Dante would say those things against the Pope, whereas some of you Catholics were going, ooh. I think the reason for that was, this is how the Pope is presented, even to this day in some ways, this is how the Pope is presented. But in that time, the popes had just enormous amounts of power, and they were not shy in using it. So yes, that is an issue. That's a problem. It's going to produce more problems. But again, let me just say one more time that the medieval period was also responsible for good things. It was not just a blight upon the course of history, something to skip through quickly until we can get to the Renaissance. You have scholasticism, which is really a rigorous exercise in applying reason to faith. We want to understand why we believe what we do. The motto of St. Anselm of Canterbury, faith-seeking understanding. It's a wonderful motto for this time period as a whole, because this scholasticism was all about, we want to understand why. We want to not just accept it. So the caricature is they just accept superstitions and stupid stuff. It's actually the opposite with the scholastics because they say we want to understand. So in this time period, you have monasteries, but the monasteries aren't just where weird monks go to pray. They build libraries, they build schools. Cathedrals, big churches have libraries and schools that are attached to them and associated with them. Centers of learning popping up all over Europe. Aquinas, we already mentioned, doctor of the church. What Aquinas did was, in keeping with the theme of the scholastic period, he said, all right, here's biblical teaching. Here is Aristotle and the classical stuff, the really brilliant ancient philosophy, most of it coming from the ancient Greek world. Let me go bang and put them together. It's the second time I've done that hand motion today. I'm not sure. I must be, I don't know, whatever. And put them together and synthesize them and make a wonderfully rich, rational Christian doctrine. They're still reading Aquinas for a reason. He was really able to synthesize the best of Aristotle with the best of the biblical teaching and produce something that was just really extraordinary. Even today, it's extraordinary. And part of what Aquinas was doing, which makes it even more interesting, was that he was producing this theology not just as a way, not just as an exercise in theology. He was doing it partly to respond to Jewish and Muslim scholars who were pushing the church on certain issues and certain questions. The church needed to answer some of the questions that Jewish scholars and Muslim scholars were bringing to their attention, and Aquinas was the one, more than anyone else, to step up and to do that. And again, his work, his masterwork, was called the Summa Theologiae. And again, I said this before, but the sum of theology, you can get a sense of what the goal of the book was. So yeah, you have scholasticism, you have Aquinas. These are really good things. You also have Celtic Christianity, which is really interesting in this period because Celtic Christianity takes a particular interest in the way in which God is revealed through the natural world. So for any of you today with modern environmentalist sensibilities, for example, Celtic Christianity is a really interesting branch to study because they look at, they look at something as basic as a cat catching a fish out of a stream, and they say the power of the Lord is in that cat, in that cat's paw. And they want to understand how the stuff of the world, the rivers, the streams, the lake, all of it reveals the personality of God. And this is a direct precursor to what will go on to be called natural theology, which is another subject for another day. But basically, natural theology is how is God revealed by the contents of his works. Very much a Romans 1 type of situation where we say, well, all right, well, God is revealed in the way in which the world was created. How? How does that work? What does that look like? The Celts were kind of a precursor to that. So you also had the popular religion. If Aquinas represents the institutional Christianity at its height, you also had, as McGrath points out, you also had the popular religion, which was far removed from popes and scholars. This was down in, this was the religion that was practiced in the blacksmith shop, by the peasants and the serfs, for example. And it came in three main forms of veneration. You have commemoration. Today is the feast day of Saint such and such, where this person is remembered and there's a feast thrown in their honor. This is a form of veneration. It's a form of worship, where the popular religion, even people who are not church scholars, look at heroes of the church and honor them, and more importantly, honor God for the work that they've done. There's veneration comes in the form of relics. Martin Luther's going to talk about this, but the physical objects which have sacred significance. And then finally, there's going to be pilgrimages to shrines. You're going to travel somewhere. And again, this is by no means is this limited to Christianity. Many religions have the idea of pilgrimage. I mean, Islam comes to mind. But it comes as a major element of the popular religion in the medieval period, where Christians would go on pilgrimages to holy shrines in order to worship in a unique way. So they would, if they have a particular saint that they were affiliated with, they would go go pilgrimage to a place that was connected with that saint, to bond with that saint in a unique way, and to worship in that format. So what the popular religion does, what these types of veneration accomplish, beyond their religious value, is they provide a rhythm of life. They provide a way to grapple with life's hardships, and they provide a way for non-educated people to practice religious devotion. Because, summa theologiae, put that in the hands of a woodworker in the village, what good is that going to do? But what this offers is a way for people who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunities to practice religious devotion. It becomes very important. Of course, popular religion, again, not limited to Christianity at all. It's a major focus of study for a lot of religions, where you have the difference between the quote-unquote ivory tower, the institutional religion and the institutional theologians on one hand, and how it's actually lived on the street in the other. Some of you are religion, you religion majors, or at least minors. You hung around the religion department for a while. You're probably going to read something from Robert Orsi before it's all done. He is a master scholar of popular religion. He's well worth reading. He's really, even if you're not one of those people, but you just are curious about religious things, Orsi's great to read, because he's wonderful at studying popular religion and what it looks like and how it plays out. I would definitely recommend him to you. So anyway, the Middle Ages is complicated. All of that in a line. But it gives way to the Renaissance, gives way to humanism, gives way to what we'll see in the Reformation. What the Renaissance was about, and ultimately what the Reformation was about, was this idea of back to the sources. We are going back. Now, for the fathers of the Reformation, this has a more biblical line, but for the Renaissance and for humanism, back to the sources means back to classical antiquity, which, again, notice Aquinas is like, where you guys been? I've been here for a long time. But there's this commitment to go back to the classical antiquity, to the Greeks, to Aristotle, to that type of stuff. So for the humanists and for the Renaissance, it was let's recapture the glory of Socrates and Aristotle and all the art and the sculpture and everything that would come with that. For the church and for the fathers of the Reformation, this is back to the sources. It's back to the scriptures, back to the New Testament in particular. What they had at that time was the Vulgate Bible, put together by St. Jerome many years prior. It was deemed insufficient, so a major movement erupted to put the Bible into Greek and then into the language of the vernacular. And I want to pause here, and I want to just stress how important this is. We talked about how worthless it would be to put Aquinas in the hands of a woodworker. Remember that those Christians couldn't read the Bible either. Not only because they were unable, but because they were not allowed. The Catholic Church said that you will not, the Bible is only going to be in Latin. And as a result of that, it's only going to be read by an extraordinarily small percentage of the population. One of the major thrusts of the Reformation is we need to change this. We need to change this for biblical accuracy. That was more Erasmus's line. He's like, the Vulgate is problematic in a lot of different ways. Let us get something closer to what was originally said. And that means going back to the original language that it was composed in, going back to the Greek. But the pre-reformers, and then Luther himself, wanted to get the Bible into the hands of the people in a language where much more of them could potentially read it. They might not have been able to read Latin, but they could read German. They could read in their own vernacular. So a major thrust of the Reformation was we need to get the Bible into the hands of the people in their own language so that they can read it. And the pre-reformers, John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, and notice with these two in particular, Wycliffe, there's an organization called Wycliffe Bible Translators, which goes into countries where the Bible has not been translated into the vernacular yet and performs that work. Tyndale, there's a publishing house named after him. You get a sense of just how important this is, this act of getting the Bible into a language where it can be understood. And John Huss, they were all motivated to get the Bible into the languages of their people, and they all suffered for it. Huss died for it. Died for trying to get. He was in what we might see as as modern day Czech Republic, kind of the Eastern Europe is where Huss was located. Wanted to get the Bible into the hands of the people in the vernacular, ran afoul of the Catholic Church, and was burned at the stake for it. It's kind of a dark irony that one of his books, the title of one of the books that he wrote was "On Fire for God," and he turned out to literally be on fire for God. But this was their drive. This was their motivation. We need the Bible into the hands of people who can read it. And this leads to the Reformation. Again, my head is spinning at how fast I have to move. I'm sorry about this. If you have questions, if there's something where you're going, whoa, 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 slow down and dig a little bit, send me a message and I'll be happy to do that. But in terms of the Reformation, there's four primary branches. Lutheran, and you will see this again on the next quiz, I almost guarantee it. Lutheran, Calvinist, Radical, and Catholic. I'm going to go through all those in turn very briefly. Lutheran is probably the most fundamental version, the version most of us know. Lutheran, of course, from Martin Luther. Now, what happens with Luther? The very, very short version. He is someone who grows up. He is born not to be a theologian. He thinks he's going to be a lawyer. His father was a lawyer. He is going to be following his footsteps. Has a near-death experience and a supernatural experience where he cries out to God. He gets caught in the middle of a thunderstorm, cries out to God in his terror, and says, "If you get me through this, I'll become a monk." And he does. Pisses off his father too. But he does and becomes a monk. And he tries to be a faithful monk, but he is beset by guilt. He is in the confession booth for hours and hours and hours upon end because he can't deal with the idea of forgiveness. He says, I'm a fraud. I'm the worst monk who's ever been. I sin all the time. Look at all these sins, and lists these things that are really just not even sins, but just basically, bottom line, he's compulsive. He is compulsive, and he is fixated on this idea of sin and cannot escape from this idea of sin. He just can't. His breakthrough comes reading Romans 1:17. Reading the verse that says, basically, you are not justified by your own perfections or your own ability to keep the law. You're justified by what Jesus has already done for you. Romans 1:17 is the doorway for Luther. And he says, oh, wow, I don't have to be perfect because there was already one who was, and he did the work that I couldn't do on my behalf. Salvation has already been accomplished. There's not a bar that I have to clear. There's not a standard that I have to live up to. Because there is a person, because I can't, and there is one who already has, and the name of the game is following him. That was a revelation for Luther. That was the moment where Protestantism was born in a lot of ways. But meanwhile, while this is going on, while he's having this epiphany, there is a monk by the name of Johann Tetzel who is selling indulgences. What are indulgences? Indulgences are basically get out of jail free cards, where you can sin, but if you have an indulgence, the time that you would have spent in purgatory for that sin is shortened or waived. Not just yourself, by the way. You could also buy indulgences for family members, for those who are beloved. And Tetzel used to sell his product by showing images of fiery flames and people who are just in agony in the fire and saying, that's your mother, that's your father, that's your son. If you buy an indulgence, you can lessen their suffering. And don't you want to lessen their suffering? A horribly cynical way, obviously, but the church needed money for the massive building projects that they were undertaking at the time. And Tetzel was an aggressive salesman. So there's actually a movie that I put the link for the movie clip on, it's a YouTube clip, on the notes of the lecture. It's a great movie. If you're interested in learning more about Luther or just figuring out who the heck this guy is, this is a really accessible way to get a glimpse of his story. It's a movie called Luther, and I've included the clip. Alfred Molina, who's a great actor, plays Tetzel in this clip, and you can get a sense of what he's doing and why Luther was so horrified by it. So he is having this epiphany that it doesn't matter what we do. Jesus has already done the work perfectly, and here comes Tetzel saying, you've screwed up, or your family members have screwed up, they're suffering for their screwing up, you can reduce their suffering, just pay us money. So this is the moment where Luther says, something's very wrong here, and this is the moment that gives birth to what comes to be known as the 95 Theses. Now, what's important to remember is the 95 Theses is this is not the Declaration of Independence. This is not Luther saying, I'm done with you, we're starting this new church over here. He's not interested in separating it first. He's interested in reform. His idea is, all right, we've gone off the rails a little bit. We need to try to bring it back. Here is my contribution to the dialogue, which will hopefully end up in bringing us back to a better place, a better sense of where we need to be. This was a common way to ask for dialogue, and that's what all Luther is doing at first. He's not separating yet. That'll come. He's saying, I'm observing this. I don't like it. I don't think it's what we ought to be doing. Let's talk about it. And the 95, so he gets the 95 Thesis and he puts it up on the Wittenberg church door in 1517. This past Halloween, we just, sorry about that. This past Halloween, we just, was the 500th anniversary of that. But yeah, so that was what was going on with that. It wasn't a reformation. It wasn't a split at first. What did he want? Well, we already talked about it. He wants justification by faith alone. You are justified not for the works that you do or the money that you pay for the church. Faith in the one who did it all is what is required. He wants sola scriptura, scripture alone. Let's get rid of all the extra stuff and let's go back to the sources, back to what, the original sources, and learn what we need from that. He wants priesthood of the believer. You don't need these mediating structures to have a relationship with God. You don't need to go through a priest in order to confess. You don't need, you don't need the machinery. You need church for the community, but you don't need it to do, I'll put this in a crass way, you don't need this, you don't need it to do business with God. You already have that connection. Needless to say, the Catholic Church does not take his suggestions well, and as he continues to write, they continue to get more aggravated. They demand that he recants. There's something called the Diet of Worms, where they call Luther and they say, your stuff is crazy, you need to recant. You need to say that you were wrong or in error, otherwise stuff might happen to you. I've included the YouTube scene for that too. Again, great scene, great movie. But here, the Diet of Worms is where you get the famous line you might have heard associated with Luther, here I stand, I can do no other, God help me. The longer version of that is they say, recant. He says, show me in the scriptures where I am wrong. They say, recant. And he says, I can't. Here I stand, I can do no other, God help me. And he puts his flag in the sand and says, this is it. This is where it needs to be. There's a lot of intrigue that happens to save his life, and a lot of political. It's funny because we talked about power earlier. Come to find out that the only reason Luther is alive to do a lot of these things is because of the power of the prince in Germany where he was, who liked Luther and wanted to see Luther succeed, and also wanted to stick it to the Pope a little bit. Saved Luther's life on more than one occasion. Gave Luther the space to come up with the German Bible, often called the Luther Bible, which is the New Testament written in German. So, yeah, it's interesting. That's one of those cases where power turns out to be a good thing. But even with Luther, though, you have this tenuous relationship between theology and power, because one of the people that Luther inspires is a man named Thomas Müntzer. Thomas Müntzer reads Luther's work, especially that part about the priesthood of the believer, where we don't need the machinery of the church to do business with God anymore. All we need is the scriptures and our own personal relationship with God. So Müntzer reads this and says, all right, I'm going to read Galatians, which was a book that Luther loved, by the way. Sidebar, Luther really didn't like the book of James. If you've ever read the book of James in the New Testament, Luther didn't like it because it's a little bit too focused on works for his taste. He wanted to actually get rid of it, but then came to his senses and said, all right, I guess I won't get rid of it. I guess I'll keep it in. But he didn't like it. He loved Galatians. Wrote a brilliant commentary on Galatians. But so Müntzer is reading this, and Müntzer is going, all right, if Galatians 3:28 says there is no longer Jew nor Greek, no longer slave nor free, male nor female, but you are all one in Christ Jesus, and we have this thing about sola scriptura and priesthood of the believer, then why are we wasting our time toiling for corrupt earthly rulers, both politically and in the papacy? Let's burn it all down. Which is what they commenced to do. He says, we have been given the authority. And he considers Luther a fellow traveler. Hey, Luther is, this is great. We can go burn down, monasteries and convents and take the valuables out of there, and we can revolt against our leaders. And they do all of that. And Müntzer is thinking that Luther's a fellow traveler here, as he leads a group of peasants who vandalize churches and palaces, all these marks of earthly power. And Munzer's going, yeah, this is basically a logical outworking of your writing, Martin. So, Martin, are you in? Martin Luther was most definitely not in. He saw this as a gross misrepresentation of his ideas, and he was horrified by it, repulsed by it. So he writes a pamphlet, basically, called Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants. And I've included a quote there, but I'll just read the first line to give you an impression. Stab, smite, slay whoever can. If you die in doing it, well for you. A more blessed death can never be yours, for you die obeying the divine word and commandment in Romans 13, in loving service of your neighbor, whom you are rescuing from the bonds of hell and of the devil. So yeah, Munzer says, you started this. And Luther says, I most certainly did not. Romans 13, earthly authorities. I meant, in a spiritual sense, what the hell is wrong with you people? So he writes this letter to the nobles, to the earthly power, and says, do what you can to put this rebellion down. So it's kind of it's a rough patch, because Luther is the father of the Reformation. In some ways, he's considered to be the father of these ideas, but he says, I don't want to be the father of these ideas. This is not what I was talking about. You need to bring it down, and bring it down hard, which they do. They kill a lot of peasants in Munster as well. It's just interesting, though, because, again, you talk about power, and you talk about how theological power and political power are intertwined. Munster presses Luther, and basically gets Luther to the point where he says, I didn't mean that I didn't mean equality in a political sense. I meant it in a spiritual sense. And Munster says, what's the difference? And it really becomes an interesting issue in terms of exactly what Luther does mean. So, but anyway, that is the Reformation that most of us know. And it's known here as the Lutheran Reformation. There's also the Calvinist Reformation. Calvin comes a little bit after Luther, writes a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is a masterwork of systematic theology, published first in 1536. I think the final version came out in 1559, I want to say. He was in Geneva. He was a Frenchman, but he was in Geneva. Highly respectful of Scripture, as Luther was. The Reformed churches, if you attend or know about Presbyterian or Reformed, any of those family of churches and theologies, you can thank Calvin for that, because he was the father of those. Led what was essentially a theocracy in Geneva. It was definitely a biblically informed, it was in the two ideas, theological power and political power, were intertwined to the point where you could be fined or even imprisoned for not being Christian, basically, or for not being Christian enough. Very, very strict in how it was put together. Calvin is controversial for his embrace of double predestination. Predestination, the idea that God knows before the beginning of time which people are going to be bound for heaven and which are going to be bound for hell, and not just knows, chosen. There are verses in Scripture that Calvin and his reformed descendants look at and say, it's not a case of a human being presented with salvation and damnation and choosing one or the other. It's a case of God already from the beginning of time saying, I foreknew you, I predestined you, you have no decision in this matter. It was basically it was my delight to make you one of mine, therefore you are one of mine. That's predestination. You are predestined to be a believer. But the unsettling part of that, and the double part of that, is that you are also, if you are not one of those, if you're not a member of the elect, as they're called, then you were predestined for damnation. You were predestined for hell. And that's hard and understandably, I think, that's hard for people to get their heads around. Why? How is that possible that a loving God could basically remove the choice and just give you a one-way ticket to the lake of fire? How does that work? This is an oversimplification of a very complicated theological point. But this is basically the battle lines in terms of predestination, in Reform. That's a major mark of Reformed theology. Those of you who grew up in those churches, you might have heard of TULIP, which is the acronym for what is called 5-point Calvinism. I'm not going to be able to remember it off the top of my head. But let me talk about the T. The T stands for total depravity. And that is how Reformed people can look at this and say, no, this is not unfair. This is just, because all of us are totally depraved. We are fallen. We are sinful creatures. We all deserve hell. And it's just the mercy of God that delivers some people from that fate while leaving others to that fate. It's not a case of unfair versus unfair. It's a case of mercy towards some, but not towards others. It's an impartial mercy, but it is mercy nonetheless. It's a partial mercy, but it's mercy nonetheless. And it's not God being unfair. It's God actually practicing charity and practicing grace and giving those who don't deserve it the opportunity to be his people. So again, that's a really simplified version of that. Third branch is called the Radical branch, the Radical Reformation. And this is basically focused on the Anabaptists community. The Anabaptists give birth to what we now know as the Mennonites. Also, the Amish community comes out of this tradition. Anabaptists is literally the rebaptizers. The believer's baptism is a critical point of disagreement here. Why? Well, in the Lutheran and Calvinist, in the Lutheran and Calvinist branches of the Reformation, there is not believer's baptism. It's basically just sprinkling the babies. And in the Catholic Church, same thing. And all of these serve as ways to mark these babies, these infants, before they are old enough to choose as members of the community, or at least hopefully to be members of the community, members of the body. Now, of course, not everyone who is sprinkled turns out to become a member of the body. And you have what are known as mixed congregations, where believers and non-believers are all in the same church. They're all together. The Anabaptists look at that and go, no, that's not what it's supposed to look like. You need to be baptized into the community. The community needs to be all believers, all those who are committed, and all those who have verbalized their commitment to God. So where the Anabaptist community is, you have chosen to be here. The other branches are mixed communities where there are people who are devout next to people who aren't, but they're all in the same community. It's a mixed community. The Anabaptists say, no, that's not how it's supposed to work. So obviously it makes for much smaller communities, more tight-knit communities, and more devout communities in some ways. The Anabaptists write something called the Schleichheim Confession in 1527, basically just a statement of beliefs. And believer's baptism is a large one. You must be baptized into this community. Pacifism is another one. We will not take up the sword, quote unquote, the sword, in any capacity. We will not participate in wanton violence, obviously, but we will also not pick up the sword on behalf of the state. We will not be the state's instrument of violence. So that means, we won't get a job as executioners. We won't get a job in the military. Whereas Luther says, yes, do it. Do it proudly. You're doing it for God and you're obeying your earthly authorities. So if you are called to be the executioner, basically show up with bells on and chop off heads with gusto. Again, that's kind of an outworking of different types of theology, different types of theological disagreements. The Anabaptists are pacifists. We do not take the sword. So the Anabaptists were hated by everyone. Hated by Catholics, but also hated by Lutherans as well. And a lot of Anabaptists were suffered and were tortured and died in really awful ways. Google, if you have a strong stomach, Google something called tongue screws, and you will see a way in which Anabaptists were often punished. Kind of really just a cynical, awful. You also have the Dirk Willems story, which I gave you to read and also reflect on this week. It's an amazing story. I won't say anything about it here because I want to read your responses, but man, I love that story. And then finally, there's the Catholic Reformation, also called the Counter-Reformation, spurred by the Council of Trent in 1545. Basically, we need to take these concerns seriously, but we need to handle them in-house. And the Council of Trent was not a capitulation of Luther, but in a sense, but also saying, all right, we've clearly got some issues we've got to work through. Let's work through them in-house. And the Council of Trent was called as a way to do that. McGrath is key here. He's absolutely right when he says that this is an internal reformation. This is as much an internal reformation as it is a response to external pressures. It's not just, oh, there's a thing called Protestants now and we need to react to that. It's, we've got issues and we need to address them. And how do they address them? They address them in a lot of different ways. One of the major ways, they revitalize old religious orders and create new ones. The Jesuits, which we're going to start talking about silence. We're going to talk about the Jesuits a lot. But the Jesuits emerged from the Council of Trent. Current Pope, Pope Francis, is a Jesuit by training. So a lot of interesting developments happening there. So this also is a wing of, even though most people look at the Reformation as an exclusively Protestant phenomenon, there is also a Catholic branch, sometimes called Counter-Reformation, but it's more of a, all right, we need to work. Luther was crazy going off and starting out his own thing, but he was right, and others were right, that we have problems we need to address. Let's address them, and that's what was going on. So those are your four major branches. You have Lutheran, Calvinist, Radical, and you have the Catholic Reformation. Now there are some smaller sub-branches. The English Reformation, for example. McGrath talks about that, so I'm not going to talk about it as much. But you have people like, you know, the formation of what we know as the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church. Well, and the Episcopal Church comes out of the English Reformation. So you have Henry IV, Thomas More, these really famous figures in that tradition. But yeah, so I mean, what can you say? You could do this class all about the Reformation. You could do multiple classes all about the Reformation. It's a pivotal event in the story of Christian history. But one thing it does represent, and I think one thing to focus on here, I've been talking about power quite a bit. And before the Reformation, you have outward displays of power. The papacy at its height. Remember Henry IV in the snow for 3 days groveling, and Gregory VII says, all right, I guess we'll let you back in. Religion serves as an identity marker. You are part of this community. But with the Reformation has what is sometimes known as the inward turn, where religion goes from something that is largely external. How do you know you're a Christian? Well, because you belong to this group and you practice these things. You go on pilgrimages, you have relics, so on and so forth. Goes from that to more of, it becomes more internalized, it becomes more intellectualized, it becomes more the subject of private, individualized devotion. Why is this happening? Well, because one of the after effects of the Reformation, the mix of power between political and theological power, we've already talked about it several times. In the onset of the Reformation, you have more people joined up with different identity groups who don't like each other, who have reason to compete with and kill each other. You have Protestants killing Catholics, you have Catholics killing Protestants, you have everyone killing the Anabaptists. The connection between religious devotion and political power was producing a lot of dead bodies. And that's probably the simplest way I can say it. So as McGrath puts it, the scene was set for the Enlightenment's insistence that religion was to be a matter of private belief rather than one of state policy. So whereas before, if you were in a certain province or a certain country, you were Catholic or you were Protestant, and that's just how it was. Or unless your leaders changed, and then you had to change too, your religion was basically external. It was a coat you put on. It starts to become a matter of private belief, something that's more internal, more internalized, something that is more, which would eventually go on to become more privatized, something that you do in your world and just let everyone else do theirs. So again, this is partly in response, all right, how do we get along with each other and not kill each other? This was one of the just big cultural movements that tried to answer that question. At the same time, the seeds of democracy were also beginning to be sown. I mean, you think about the time period this is leading up towards in 1600s, 1700s. 1700s, late 1600s into the 1700s is an extraordinarily fruitful time for revolution. You have a glorious revolution in England in 1688. You have the American Revolution, obviously, and the French Revolution, both happening in the late 1700s. And there is also a connection to theology there, because these movements take the established power and say, you have too much power, I'm going to overthrow it, also had a connection to the church. Because remember, church and state power were closely bound together. So in a lot of ways, the American Revolution, what are we revolting against? Well, we're revolting against the King of England, sure, but we're also revolting against the Church of England. And this is even more pronounced with the French Revolution, because the French revolutionaries actually confiscate Catholic Church land and say this is not yours anymore. It is an overt attack on not just the Bourbon monarchy, but also the church authorities too. So you have this sense of, all right, these different religious identities are beginning to form. There's going to be tension between them. Religion is going to be something that becomes more independent, more internalized, independent and internalized individual, rather than just something that's just kind of external and largely community based. So you're going to see that continue. The inward turn starts to manifest in a number of different ways. You can talk about, I asked you to read Wesley's conversion. Wesley is influenced by the school of thought known as Pietism, which is much more emotional, much more personal form of religious devotion. He feels his heart strangely warmed. You have Zinzendorf, who is a Pietist leader, sets up these little communities. You have basically you have a focus on emotionalism. If scholasticism is all intellectual structure, Calvin, systematic theology, Pietism and other forms of emotionalism are, how does this religion make you feel on the inside as an individual? Do you feel emotional power? And if you do, then your brand of religion is authentic. Wesley feels his heart strangely warmed, and for him that's confirmation that he's onto something. And it leads him to start what becomes the Methodists. This sense of competing against the old, formalized, stodgy, stale religious structures of the Church of England, and saying, all right, we got something new here. So this move, this Enlightenment move, on the heels of the Reformation, is to say, all right, it went from this externalized thing to this individualized thing, this thing that's private, this thing that's more based on emotion, this thing that becomes ultimately more subjective. And that's going to really produce some interesting fruit, both good and bad, in the days to come. So I feel like I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to kind of speed through some of the rest of this. You have the Great Awakening, which is a hell of a thing to speed through because it's an extraordinarily important series of religious revivals in America. Jonathan Edwards, the keystone for this, the catalyst of this. The Great Awakening happens in 1734. Wesley, again, we talked about Wesley already. He's a major figure in this as well. He's the one that says, all right, the church authority, the ecclesiastical authority says, you must come to this building to hear the message. I'm going to take my message to you. His famous line is, the world is my parish. He becomes a circuit riding preacher, goes to people where they are and preaches to them and speaks to them. George Whitefield, another one. I'm going to quote McGrath again here. It is no exaggeration to say that the roots of the American Revolution lay in the growing religious alienation between the new popular American religion and the established religion of England. Within a generation of the Great Awakening, the colonies were in revolt against the colonial power. So again, this Great Awakening is more emotionalized, it's more pietist, it's more let's overthrow the structures of power and go and bring this message to everyone. This lays the seeds for the impulse for democracy, because if the process goes from we must do whatever the popes say, and the Reformation happens, then we become a lot more autonomous and a lot more individualized. We do what we feel is the right thing to do before God. There's a parallel track between that theological line and the political line of we must do everything the king says. Well, why? We can do it ourselves. And we can overthrow the tyranny of the king and run things ourselves way better. American Revolution. They run on parallel tracks. So I think McGrath is absolutely right, because the religious track comes first and it leads directly to the political track. It's just interesting to contemplate. And I would really advise you to read McGrath carefully this week because it's really, really interesting stuff. Anyway, the other part of McGrath I asked you to read was basically a rundown of the major denominations. Of course, one of the major offshoots of the Reformation is this idea of denominations and different ways of thinking about these issues. You have Catholicism, Vatican II, which is a conference that happens in the 60s. The key term from Vatican II was aggiornamento. We're going to basically, we're remodeling. We're bringing our Catholicism into the 20th century. How are we doing that? We're maintaining a traditional hierarchy, but we're also understanding that power is not so centralized in a globalized world. It's a lot more diffuse. It's a lot more spread out. We need to respond to that. You have Eastern Orthodox, which we haven't talked about much, and that's a problem. Dreyer, actually, if you read Dreyer carefully, which I hope you did, you got a pretty good education about Eastern Orthodox because he worships at a Russian Orthodox church. You have Protestants, which we've already talked about. Two of the main sub-movements that McGrath talks about in this chapter are the Pentecostals, the ones who are charismatic. They believe in outward acts of the Holy Spirit, such as speaking in tongues, and evangelicals. Evangelicals are fascinating, especially nowadays in light of our political developments here in the last election cycle, but they continue to be an object of study and a focus of study. But on a larger track, you have what we're experiencing now, because the Reformation leads to denominations, and denominations explode, and there are still thousands of denominations to this day. But what we're seeing now, and I'll try to summarize this as I close, the lines between denominations are not quite so sharply drawn as they used to be. Whereas it used to be Catholics and Protestants hated each other. And Protestants in the 20th century spent a lot of time persecuting Catholics. John Kennedy in the 1960s, he'll never win the presidency. He's a Catholic. How's he going to win? That was the thought. And the thought was that if Kennedy won, he would basically cede power to the Pope, and America would become an instrument of the Pope. People actually believe that. So you used to have these really sharp lines between denominations. The lines now are not between denominations, but they're between the ones who are more devout, more nominal, and more secular. So you have devout, for example, you have devout Catholics and evangelicals coming together for purposes like they'll both, Catholics and evangelicals, attend March for Life, for example, or they speak out against human trafficking. Whereas a nominal Catholic, well, let me put it this way, it used to be that a nominal Catholic still had more in common with a devout Catholic than he did with any Protestant. But nowadays, the lines are being drawn that nominal Catholics have a lot more in common with nominal Protestants than they do with devout Catholics, whereas devout Catholics have a lot more in common with devout Protestants than they do with nominal Catholics. That is much more the focus nowadays. So it'll continue to move that way. We'll talk about the future of Christianity as we look farther into the course. But that is interesting because that seems to be the way it's going. But that's enough yammering for one day. Next week we start reading Silence. We get into talking about missionaries, the Jesuits, expansion, colonialism, all those other fun things. Man, this one turned out long, but I still feel like I went really fast. If you have any questions or further need of clarification, obviously let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next week.